The night shift bled into a stubborn gray that clung to the hospital windows like a film no disinfectant could cut. Elera Quiñones peeled off her gloves and watched the red indentations on her wrists fade, ghost bands left by hours of latex and worry. The scent of chlorhexidine and coffee clung to her scrubs, and fatigue hummed like power lines behind her eyes. She told herself it was just another night, 3 codes, a hard conversation, a teenager who wouldn't meet her gaze until she said the word safe and meant it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. Elera clocked out at 4:11 a.m., the time when even the vending machine lights looked tired. The automatic doors exhaled her into a pre-dawn that tasted like rain, the sky the color of a bruise just before it yellows. Her Civic waited at the far edge of the staff lot, a small, patient thing with a cracked windshield and a stubborn check engine light. She stacked her bag on the hood, rubbed her neck, and listened to the city hold its breath. She could have gone straight home. She should have. Her mother would be awake in an hour, the arthritis at the base of her thumbs already whispering its complaints. Rent was due in 10 days. The student loans she had stopped looking at had quietly fattened in the dark like bread dough, swelling with interest while she was too busy keeping people alive to keep up with the paperwork of her own life. But she didn't get to go home quickly, because trouble, as usual, had legs. The roar didn't fit the hour. It came from the service road that ran along the hospital's back fence, the kind of sound that made the pigeons lift as one and the security guard sit up a little straighter in his glass booth. Then the roar hiccuped, coughed, and died. 2 blocks away, a single headlight bobbed and went out. The sudden silence rang. Elera felt it as plainly as she felt the ache in her arches. Somebody needed help. Bad idea, she told herself, moving anyway. The asphalt radiated the night's stored heat through her soles. A thin mist drifted up from the storm drains, and her breath showed in the early fall chill. She rounded the corner of the chain-link fence, slipped past a dumpster that smelled like oranges and bleach, and stepped into the flicker of a faulty streetlight. The motorcycle slouched against the curb like it had been knifed. A man stood beside it, helmet off, head bowed like he was choosing his words carefully before speaking them aloud. He was big the way old live oaks are big, trunk thick through the shoulders, weathered at the edges. His beard was a salt and pepper snarl. The patch on his vest made her stop, a white skull winged in red and black. Hell's Angels. Elera's stomach drew a tight loop and then let go. She had taken care of men with that patch. Some had been stubborn, some sweet, some mean as hornets until they weren't. She'd learned not to read a patch like a diagnosis. People were people, under the leather and the stories. He looked up when her shoes scuffed the curb. Under the sodium light his eyes were pale, lids swollen with sleep he hadn't gotten. "You okay?" she asked, pulling her hoodie tighter across her scrubs. "I heard you cut out." "Flat," he said. His voice had gravel in it. "Picked up a nail 20 blocks back. Limped it as far as I could. No toe till 7. I'm kind of stuck." He angled his chin toward the hospital without exactly looking at it, like hospitals were old battlefields he preferred to circle. She stepped closer to the bike. The tire looked like a bitten lip, soft where it should have held. Elera crouched, fingers already reaching for the valve cap like this was any patient, any problem that could be solved with a tool and the right tone of voice. "I've got a plug kit in my trunk," she said, surprising herself a little. "And a mini compressor that takes a year but gets the job done. If the nail didn't shred the sidewall." He watched her with a half-smile that resembled skepticism trying on hope. "You carry a plug kit?" "I carry everything," Elera said. "Welcome to nursing." The truth was simpler, she carried a plug kit because it had cost $12 on sale and had saved her 3 times already. She carried jumper cables because strangers had rescued her dead battery on bitter mornings more than once. She carried snacks because low blood sugar lay in wait like a snake in the grass of every night shift. Her car trunk was a small, rolling testimony to a belief she hadn't had the luxury to romanticize. The world was unpredictable, but preparation was a kind of love. He touched the tank like it was a living animal. Name's Morgan, he said. Morgan Vance. Elara, she said. Hold the bike. I'll grab the kit. When she popped her trunk, a tide of odds and ends shifted toward her: extra shoes in a grocery bag, a stethoscope in a velvet pouch, a sweater she kept forgetting to take inside. She snapped open the red plastic case, the tools neat in their foam cutouts like a little surgeon's kit. Morgan crouched beside her as she worked, the leather of his vest creaking softly. Up close he smelled like cold air and gasoline and something human underneath: sweat and cloves, maybe. She found the nail by feel when her fingertips scraped the steel head embedded in rubber. That's it, she murmured, more to herself than to him. Lucky angle. Didn't gut the sidewall. He huffed out a small laugh. Lucky, huh? His eyes took in the yellowed hospital, the humming transformer on the pole, the empty road. I been on a luck drought. Elara threaded the reamer into the puncture, the rubber resisting like muscle. He watched her hands the way families watch a nurse place a line, curious, suspicious, desperate for the small mercy of competence. The road whispered with the occasional distant truck, the sky slowly unbruising to a deep, promising blue. Night shift, he asked. Double, she said. They dangled time and a half and a guilt trip. Guilt pays better. Every time. She twisted the T-handle. The reamer obeyed. She pulled it free, threaded a sticky plug through the needle tool, and pressed it home with steady pressure. The rubber bit, swallowed, held. She trimmed the excess with a box cutter and sat back on her heels. Okay. Air it and pray. Morgan held the compressor while she clipped it to his battery. It stuttered to life, the sound small but dogged. The tire's skin plumped under the flow. Elara felt a knot loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was there. She watched pressure climb on the cheap gauge and tried not to think about rent and the past due notice she had folded under her phone case like a talisman that burned when she touched it. Why you carrying groceries in your eyes? Morgan asked unexpectedly, not unkind. Elara blinked. Excuse me? Looks like you're counting bills, he said, nodding toward her face instead of using a finger like other men might. Not my business. Just. I recognized the expression. She thought about lying. She thought about laughing it off. But honesty was cheaper and sometimes the only thing that didn't break later. My mom's hands don't open in the mornings anymore, she said. Rheumatoid. On the wait list for a specialist that might as well be on Mars. Rent's creeping like ivy. My little brother's pretending to graduate while his guidance counselor pretends to care. And I keep thinking if I stack enough doubles the math will reverse itself. It never does. Morgan looked at the tire as if he could will it to hold. I got an ex who called it carrying the month in my shoulders, he said. Like the calendar lived up here. He touched the ridge of muscle where his neck met his back. You ain't alone. Doesn't fix it, but sometimes it's good to hear. They let the compressor hum into the quiet. When the gauge pushed past 32, she unhooked it and listened for leaking. The plug held like a secret. You just saved me from an argument with a tow driver, Morgan said. And maybe from missing something I can't miss. Elara wiped her hands on a shop towel she kept for exactly this, then offered him a bottle of water from the trunk that tasted like plastic in relief. What can't you miss? He hesitated. The street light buzzed and then steadied. An old friend. I promised her I'd be on time. She's got a clock running I can't argue with. Hospice, Elara's mind supplied, soft and automatic. She didn't ask. Sometimes you respect the shape of someone's silence. Morgan straightened up, the leather of his vest shifting to reveal more patches, Local 13, red and white, one with a small embroidered angel whose face had been deliberately left blank. Hell's Angels was 1,000 individual stories knotted to one name. Elara knew better than to guess which one was his. You're good at fixing, he said, eyeing the bike, then her. Even when it ain't your job. It's always my job, she said. Just not always paid. They stood with the sudden awkwardness of people who had done something intimate, worked side by side in pre-dawn quiet, without knowing each other's last names. Alara felt the moment tipping toward goodbye. You got a number? Morgan said, and then grimaced like he'd used the wrong words for the right thing. I mean, your Venmo or something. I don't take help for free. I didn't do it for money. She heard how that sounded and immediately regretted it, because the truth was she could have used $20 like the earth could use rain. He read it in her face and didn't push it open. I'd like to square it anyway, he said. One way or another. Tell you what. She glanced at the patch again, then back at him, measuring. Pay it forward. Not the pretty kind. The inconvenient kind. And if you really want to buy something, they sell those plug kits at the auto store on 27th, get one. Stick it in your saddlebag. It's ugly as a brick but it'll keep you moving. Morgan's mouth did that not quite smile again. Yes, ma'am. He put his helmet on, the visor lifting once so he could look at her straight. Alara. Ride safe, she said. He eased the bike off the curb. The tire held. When he rolled on the throttle, the engine caught and growled with a satisfaction that felt almost indecent at that hour, like laughter in a church. He lifted 2 fingers as he passed her, half salute, half promise, and disappeared into the thinning dark. Alara stood in the street with the compressor still warm in her hands and realized her heart had been racing. Maybe because of the patch. Maybe because helping anyone carries a risk the body understands before the mind does. By the time she reached her apartment, the sky was deciding to commit to morning. The building was a 3-story with the color of old chewing gum and a landlord who called once a month to ask if she'd received the same letter he sent last month. The hallway smelled like old carpet and someone's late-night curry. Her mother's door stood ajar, a habit that had started after the first time her fingers wouldn't obey and had never really gone away. Mommy? Alara called softly. In here, her mother answered, voice scratchy from disuse and dreams. Alara found her in the kitchen wrapped in a sweater with a missing button. Luz Quinones had a face that told all the family's jokes even when she wasn't speaking and eyes that refused to stop shining no matter what the world cost that month. She was working at the lid of a jar with both palms, breath held like the jar would be offended if she exhaled before the attempt. Give me that, Alara said gently, and twisted the lid off with a pop. Luz made a sound that lived somewhere between gratitude and grief. I used to open these for you, she said. When you were tiny and insisted everything should be pickle. Now everything is pickle, Alara said. She set the jar down and kissed the top of her mother's head. We evolve. Her little brother, Timo, thumped into the kitchen in socks, hair pointing north in defiance. He was 17 with a basketball player's calves and a toddler's appetite, and he loved to pretend he was already a man because life had tried to convince him otherwise too soon. You look like you fought a truck, he said, squinting at her. And lost. Thanks, Alara said. Good morning to you too. He rummaged in the cabinet for cereal that wasn't there and made a face like betrayal. Alara opened the fridge and took inventory the way she counted drips on and 4. Milk breathing its last. Half a lemon. Leftovers labeled in her handwriting, eat me first, eat me second, I'm a science project, do not eat. I'll hit the store after I sleep, she said too brightly. We'll be okay till then. Her mother's gaze flickered to the magnet on the fridge that held the past due notice like a prize they didn't want. Luz smoothed the corner of the paper as if neatness were a spell. We're fine, Mija, she said. We always find a way. We always find a way had done a lot of heavy lifting in the Quinones household. Alara felt it in her back and in her jaw and in the place her worry lived like a permanent tenant. She poured the last of the cereal into Timo's bowl and cut a banana into coins to disguise the scarcity. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A message from an unfamiliar number, unsaved, unsentimental. You got home safe? She stared at it for a heartbeat, then another. Yes. You? Made it. Bike's holding. Good. A pause. You sure I can't square it? She typed and erased a dozen versions of no. Finally she settled on. Pay it forward. The inconvenient kind. The dots pulsed. Copy. Another pause. You ever need anything? She smiled despite herself. Like a flat fixed at 4 a.m.? Like heavy things carried? Or someone to tell a stubborn landlord to read the law? Or just, hell, I don't know. I'm better at wrenches than words. But I'm not nothing. She didn't know what to do with that. She tucked the phone under the past due notice and pulled her mother into a gentle stretch that made Luz hiss and then sigh, breath falling back into her body like it had found its path again. Elara slept for 3 hours. In her dream, the compressor hummed and would not stop, filling something that wouldn't quite fill. When she woke, the world had fully inhabited morning. She brewed coffee and fed the neighbor's orange cat that had adopted their windowsill whenever the sun found it. She paid a bill that did not shrink the pile so much as rearrange the heights. She wrote a list for the grocery store and put it in her pocket like a promise she could keep. The elevator was out again, so she and Timo took the stairs, her mother laughing that soft laugh that forgave the universe for its poor design. The sidewalk glittered with broken glass that had been swept to the edges on a previous day and waited patiently for someone to care. They made it to the corner store where the man behind the counter greeted Luz like a favorite aunt and charged them the old price for rice. Elara practiced the quiet mathematics of stretching $1 until it squealed and felt almost proud of the mosaic of items in their basket when she had finished: beans, eggs, tomatoes, the big bag of tortillas that would become 6 different meals if she danced with it long enough. On the walk home, Timo dribbled an invisible basketball and narrated his own highlight reel under his breath. Luz set the pace, stubbornly slow but steady. Elara heard the small sounds of their block waking up, the hiss of a bus door, the squeal of a bicycle brake, an argument dissolving into laughter 3 stories up. By noon, the apartment smelled like sofrito and warm tortillas. Elara smiled into the steam like a plant turning toward a window. She didn't notice the black Jeep idling across the street. She didn't see the man in the passenger seat tip his chin toward their door, or the way the driver shook his head like a compromise failing. She didn't know the landlord had hired someone to check the problem tenants because he had read a thread online about strategies that pushed people out without technically evicting them. She didn't know, because all she knew how to do was feed the people she loved and try not to let the calendar live in her shoulders. The knock came at 3:07. Timo jumped. Luz's hands tightened around the dishcloth. Elara wiped her palms on her jeans and opened the door to find 2 men with clipboards that didn't hold paper. The taller one introduced himself without introducing himself, his smile all gums and assumption. "Afternoon, miss," he said. "We're here to do a quick safety inspection. Gas lines. You know. We had that last month," Elara said. "By the city. You have a badge?" He laughed like she was adorable. "We can come back when the man of the house is home." Elara let the silence fill in around that ridiculous sentence. "No need," she said, voice even. "We're not letting anyone in without proper ID. You can leave a card." He didn't have one. Of course he didn't. The other man didn't meet her eyes, just watched the hallway like it might attack him. They left with a loud sigh that said this was the beginning of a new game, and Elara closed the door with hands that wanted to shake but didn't. "Landlord?" Luz asked quietly. "Landlord," Elara said. She leaned her forehead against the door for a beat, then turned back to the stove. "We eat. We breathe. We don't let them pull us into the fight they want. Not today." Her phone buzzed again. The unknown number. "Everything good?" She considered lying again. Then. Had visitors. Fake inspection. Landlord being creative. "Want me to swing by?" "You don't have to get in the middle. I live in the middle." "Where is it?" She didn't send her address. She did not send it either. She put the phone down and stirred the pot until the steam fogged her glasses and made the kitchen look like a dream of a better kitchen. The day stretched. Elara napped in a chair and woke with the stubborn certainty that she was late for meds that weren't there. Evening slipped toward evening the way it always does, intimately and without apology. Timo did his homework loudly at the table to convince the homework to do itself. Luz watched a telenovela and scolded the heroine lines ahead because she had already learned the math of this story too well. At 11, the building quieted. Someone laughed in the courtyard and then apologized for being alive past 10. The city's sirens braided themselves into a lullaby that had, over the years, taught Alara's nervous system to interpret urgency as background music. She washed dishes until the sink shone like a small promise and turned off the lights. She was lowering herself into bed when the phone chimed a third time. "You awake?" She stared at the ceiling. "Barely. Didn't want to bother. Figured you'd be out. But if you need milk or bread or whatever, I'm passing near 28th. We're okay. Thank you. Copy." Another pause that felt like a decision forestalled. "You got little ones?" "A brother with a metabolism. A mother with stubborn hands." "Roger that. Sleep while you can." She finally let the dark take her. She dreamed about the tire again, except this time it wasn't rubber. It was everything: her mother's joints, the rent due, the invisible basketball, the hallway men with empty clipboards. She pressed the plug into the hole and prayed it would hold. It did. Until it didn't. At 3:58 a.m., the first engine woke her. Not the whine of a car or the deep chest of a truck, but the growl of a V-twin that rumbled like a controlled storm. It rolled down the block, idled, and cut. Then another. And another. The sound multiplied until it wasn't sound anymore but weather. The building vibrated painless and thrilling, like a train passing under the floorboards. Alara sat up, heart punching her ribs. Timo stumbled out of his room in boxer shorts and a hoodie, hair confused again. Luz moved to the window with the air of someone who had earned the right to be unafraid of anything. "What is that?" Timo asked, eyes bright with the first honest curiosity he'd shown in days. Alara went to the window, lifted the blind with 2 fingers, and looked down onto their block. Headlights stood in a neat row like candles on a cake someone had decided the neighborhood could finally afford. Bikes, dozens, lined the curb and double-parked where the city only pretended to enforce the rules before dawn. Men and women in leather moved with quiet, purposeful choreography. A pickup backed to the curb, tailgate dropped, bed full of something that looked like boxes. Another truck pulled up behind it. A third. Engines cut one by one, leaving a pocket of quiet held up by breath and possibility. Alara's phone buzzed on the sill. "Open your door." She stared at the message until her vision focused. She looked down again. A figure peeled away from the group and tilted his head back toward their window, helmet hooked on 2 fingers. Morgan Vance. Luz put a hand on her daughter's back. "Mija?" Alara swallowed and found that her mouth had gone dry. She had already saved a life today and fed her little family and negotiated a small peace with a landlord who thought intimidation counted as maintenance. She hadn't prepared for this. She couldn't have. The hallway beyond their door filled with footsteps. Somewhere downstairs the ancient front latch failed and swung wide. The building's cats announced themselves as witnesses. The elevator, broken, creaked anyway like it wanted to be part of the moment. The knock that came was gentle, like someone tapping on a full glass to get the room's attention without spilling anything. Alara turned the deadbolt. Behind her, Timo whispered, "What if it's the fake inspectors again?" "It's not," she said. She didn't know how she knew. She just knew. She opened the door. The corridor filled with the smell of cold leather and winter air and oranges, bright as daylight. Morgan stood there with his helmet dangling in a grin that looked out of place on his weathered face until you realized it was the only expression big enough for what he was doing. Behind him, the narrow hallway had become a procession, hands carrying boxes, shoulders carrying weight, a little parade with no music. "Morning, Nurse Alara," Morgan said softly, like the hour belonged to them. "We brought a few things." She stared at the top box until the label swam into sense. Milk. The next, eggs. Flour. A crate of tomatoes. A bag of rice the size of a small child. A flat of canned beans. Another of diapers, though she hadn't mentioned a baby to anyone. the third man in line carried a new space heater still in plastic. Timo made a sound like the first time you sink a 3 from the parking lot. Luz pressed her hand against her chest and then dropped it, because she wasn't going to perform gratitude like a pageant. She wanted to meet this moment in the eyes. Elara finally found her voice. "What are you doing?" Morgan tilted his head, as if the answer were obvious. "Paying it forward," he said. "The inconvenient kind." In the pause that followed, the building seemed to lean toward them. The neighbors' doors cracked. Eyes glittered from the shadows like cats deciding whether to come closer. Someone on the third floor called, "What's all that?" with suspicion that carried its own long history. Morgan glanced past Elara at the thinness of their lives arranged with such care, the taped rug, the careful plants, the calendar that kept its accusations to itself. He looked back at her, and for a moment the leather and the patch and the stories about what men like him were capable of fell away. What remained was a human being who had needed help at an ungodly hour and had received it without being asked for credentials. He shifted the top box toward her. "You fixed what kept me from being where I had to be," he said. "Let us fix a thing or two you've been carrying." Elara didn't step back. She didn't step forward either. She stood like a woman at the lip of a cliff that was also a threshold, measuring the drop in the view and discovering there was a bridge she couldn't see until she took the first step. Behind Morgan, the stairwell trembled again with boots on concrete. The rumble outside swelled, not louder, but wider, like dawn itself had chosen to arrive on 2 wheels. Elara drew a breath that reached all the way to the place fatigue kept for itself, and she opened the door wider. She hadn't yet seen the second line of riders, the ones not carrying food but folders. She hadn't seen the woman in the back with a clipboard that wasn't empty, her hair braided and her mouth set like someone who had filed 200 housing complaints and wasn't tired yet. She hadn't seen the old man with the Hells Angels rocker and a cane, who had coached his son through 2 divorces and now coached his chapter through acts of stubborn kindness that didn't require applause. She hadn't seen the landlord across the street, sitting up in bed like a startled dog, trying to decide if this was a parade or a problem. She hadn't seen any of that, yet. She took the first box, milk, eggs, bread stacked like soft architecture, and felt its weight tilt toward her chest and then settle. She made room on the counter. She turned back for the next. And the next. A small procession began, ridiculous and holy in that dingy hallway, an algorithm of decency that multiplied by hand. Neighbors emerged, some with suspicion still stitched into their foreheads, some with open faces like children at a window. A woman from 2B stepped forward with a scarf around her rollers and said, "My niece, she just had a baby." "If there's diapers," and the biker behind Morgan said, "There are," as if he'd made 2 lists and checked them both. Elara moved in the new choreography as if she'd always known the steps. Accept. Place. Return. Breathe. She didn't notice the man at the end of the line pause to look at the past due notice under the magnet and write something on a sticky note he'd brought in his pocket for exactly this. She didn't notice the woman with the braid tape a tenant rights hotline under it with blue painter's tape that wouldn't peel the cheap paint when removed. By the time the counter disappeared under boxes, the floor had become a map to the hallway, and the hallway had become an artery to the street. The city outside had softened from ink to charcoal to slate. Rain started lightly, then steadied into a fall that cleaned the air without demanding payment. Morgan leaned against the doorframe like he'd been born to that angle. He watched Elara move, saw the way she negated her own exhaustion by instinct. He saw the part of her that made lists and the part that carried months in her shoulders. He saw her, and she could feel that, like sunlight that didn't require blushing to admit. "You don't have to do this," she said once, quietly, to him and maybe to the universe. He shrugged one shoulder. "Neither did you." In the stairwell, someone laughed. It rolled down and hit the floor and broke open into more laughter, the contagious kind that makes something in your own chest lift its head and listen. The building took the sound into its walls like a medicine it hadn't known it needed. Elara reached for another box. Morgan put his hand out instead, not to stop her, but to shift some of the weight without taking it away. His palm was scarred in the ways palms get scarred when they've been used for more than holding phones. She let him take the corner. The box steadied. "Why oranges?" she asked, as the scent grew sharper. He smiled. "Joey's nana says you always bring vitamin C when you're fixing people. It's a rule. And she's scarier than anybody you think we are." Elara almost laughed. Almost cried. Landed somewhere in the alive space between. The last box came into her hands with a different weight, paper and a little metal and the rustle of plastic sleeves. She glanced at the label and frowned. "What's this?" Morgan scratched his beard. "That's the lawyer stuff. For the landlord if he decides to get cute. Not a threat. Just tools." He gestured with his chin to the braided woman in the hall. "Call Raina if you need an adult in a suit. She's our adult in a suit." Elara looked from the box to his face and felt a heat at the base of her throat that was both gratitude and terror. She didn't want a war. She couldn't afford one. She also recognized a moment when someone was drawing a line in chalk in front of her door and saying, "We can stand here, together, if standing is required." "Thank you," she said, and it was not a pageant. It was a sentence with bones. The rain sharpened. The bikes outside wore it like jewelry. The neighborhood watched from windows, from stoops, from the spaces between curtains where privacy and curiosity held hands. Down on the street, an engine restarted. Then another. The sound swelled and folded, not leaving but rearranging itself the way good orchestras do between movements. Morgan checked his phone, then looked back at her and then at the counter that had turned into a table at a feast. "We'll be back," he said, and when her shoulders tensed he added, "to the block. Not just your door. We're gonna hit a couple of buildings. Some other people could use a nudge." She didn't ask how he knew that. She knew how he knew that, because need calls to need the way storms call to storm chasers. He picked up his helmet and was about to step away when a voice cut through the rain from the sidewalk like a blade through rope. "Hey," the landlord shouted from across the street, damp in a bathrobe he'd already regretted. "You can't block the hydrant. You can't." The sentence fell apart when a woman with a toddler on her hip leaned out of a window and said, "I've been calling you for 6 months about the leak in my ceiling, Mr. Duell." Somebody else called, "My hot water's been out 3 weeks." A man from the corner store added, "But you got time for inspections at 3 in the afternoon, huh?" The sound wasn't a mob. It was a choir that had discovered it knew the same song. Morgan didn't turn toward the landlord. He kept his eyes on Elara like the rest of the world could wait until the end of this sentence. He raised his voice enough for her to hear and enough for the hallway to carry it where it needed to go. "We'll take care of the orange cat on your windowsill if you're out," he said. "Anne." "Elara?" She lifted her chin. His smile went small. "Let people be good to you. It doesn't charge interest." The building seemed to exhale. Engines caught. The stairwell emptied in a current of leather and denim and the clink of buckles. The scent of oranges and rain deepened like a promise turning into weather. Elara stood in her doorway with her mother's hand warm on her shoulder and her brother vibrating like a wire with the need to tell the story before it even finished happening. She could have closed the door. She could have returned to the quiet economy of their small kitchen and the patient arithmetic of making meals from gratitude and pantry staples. She could have told herself this was a blip, a singular morning that would not repeat, a kindness she didn't deserve and couldn't afford to bank. She did none of those things. She stood and watched the procession until the last boot cleared the last stair, until the last helmet disappeared under the stairwell's concrete mouth. She listened as the engines below found their voices and became one voice and then many again. And then the hallway shivered with a different sound. A slow, deliberate footstep. Not part of the earlier current. Not any neighbor's known rhythm. The sound of someone who had waited until the river passed, then stepped onto the rocks to cross. Elara looked up from the boxes. Morgan had not left. He stood in the mouth of the stairwell with rain in his beard and a piece of paper in his hand that had not been part of any earlier stack. His face was calmer, somehow, more dangerous for how much it wasn't. He held the paper out. "Found this on your doorframe. Tucked." His jaw flexed. Looks like your landlord decided to escalate. Elara took it. The notice bled in the damp, a 24-hour demand with invented violations lined up like dominoes, ending in a threat she didn't have the capacity to swallow or spit out. Morgan's voice dropped until it was a thing only the three of them could hear, a weather that only fit in this doorway. We don't scare easy, he said. But we do read very carefully. Behind him, one engine stayed running in the rain, idling like a question. Elara stared at the notice until the words arranged themselves into sense. She felt the familiar heat at the base of her throat, the old anger that lived like pilot light, small and steady and always capable of making a meal. She lifted her eyes to meet Morgan's. What do I do? She asked, voice steady as a scalpel. Morgan didn't answer immediately. He half-turned, glanced down the stairwell, then back. His gaze moved from Luz's hands, curled, stubborn, to Timo's wide eyes and back to Alara's hard, tired face that refused to stop shining. He said, you open your door in 10 minutes. And you let us show you what inconvenient looks like when it knocks back. From the street below, the rain intensified, the engines rose, a second wave assembling with a purpose she could feel in the soles of her feet. Elara stood in the doorway, the illegal notice softening in her damp hand, her family pressed in behind her, the morning leaning toward them like a question with only one honest answer. She set the paper on the counter. She lifted the deadbolt again, though she hadn't locked it. She looked at Morgan once more and, without realizing she was saying it out loud, whispered, okay. Morgan lifted his helmet, rain dripping from its lip, and grinned like a man who had been waiting 20 years to deliver this sentence to exactly the right person, in exactly the right hallway, on exactly the right morning. Then, Nurse Elara, he said, stepping back into the stairwell as the second wave of engines surged toward their door, welcome to dawn. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Dawn. It arrived riding pillions on engines, rain polishing the street to a dark mirror that doubled the bikes and the people and turned the whole block into a lantern of itself. Elara felt the thrum through the bones of the building and through the small bones of her ears, that particular basso reassurance a V-twin gives when it means business but refuses to be crude about it. She had thought the first wave was strange enough. The second wave made strange look like breakfast. Morgan disappeared down the stairwell with the helmet under his arm and a promise in his voice. Elara stood very still for the length of a breath, then another, the illegal notice softening in her fist like something that had finally met rain. She set it on the counter beside the milk. Luz squeezed her shoulder once and then let go, the kind of letting go that said, the next step is yours. Timo hovered, vibrating. You want me to? Shoes, Elara said. Hoodie. And do not bounce off the walls. He disappeared with a grin that wasn't polite and returned with his sneakers half-tied because speed was a kind of faith for him. Luz took her scarf from the hook and looped it once around her neck, chin up, the queen of a small kingdom who had decided to receive visitors. They opened the door. The hallway smelled intensely of wet leather, cold air, citrus, and the faint electrical tang of old wiring growing nervous with the attention. Voice-low coordination flowed around the stairwell like a river taking the shape of its bed. Elara stepped into the current. At the landing, she found Morgan again, speaking in measured tones to a woman whose braid was thick enough to be a statement. Reyna, the adult in a suit, though at this hour the suit was a waterproof shell and jeans, a messenger bag slung crosswise, its flaps stippled with rain. She held the 24-hour notice with 2 fingers like it had a smell. Predatory nonsense, Reyna said, scanning. Improper service. Wrong code citations. Illegal deadlines. I could make a bingo card out of this. Elara heard relief rush toward her and checked it at the door. Hope is addictive, you have to titrate it or you overdose. What do we do right now? Reyna's eyes were very calm. We document. We notify code. We file a harassment complaint. We warn the landlord, in writing, that any attempt to lock out, shut off utilities, or enter without proper notice will earn him a restraining order and fines tall enough to teach him new arithmetic. She looked past Elara toward the apartment, took in the groceries, the mother, the boy. Her voice softened a notch without losing its steel. And we make sure breakfast happens. Breakfast, Timo said under his breath in a tone that made breakfast sound like both a verdict and an absolution. Morgan tapped the nose of his helmet with 2 fingers, a signal Alara would later learn he used when he wanted people to recenter around what mattered. We keep this clean, he told the men and women on the stairs. No blocking hydrants. No standing in the street just to look like a calendar photo. We ain't making trouble. We're making lists. They made lists. One crew moved through the building, heads tipped back, photographing water stains on ceilings, buckled floors, a sagging stair that had been promising to break for 6 months. Another replaced burned-out hallway bulbs and dead smoke detector batteries with the care of people who understood that functioning lights and alarms aren't luxuries but quiet acts of respect. Someone wiggled the banister at the 3rd-floor turn and whistled softly. In the courtyard, a folding table appeared as if from a magician's sleeve. A woman in a red rain jacket set out a crate of clipboards and pens and forms printed crisp as a new day. Name, unit, issues, how to contact you, she said to each neighbor who approached. If you don't want them to call, check this box and I'll be the one who calls them. If you do want them to call, check this box and I'll sit with you when they do. Alara watched all of it as if she had stumbled into a hospital floor she'd never rotated through, a place where the medicine was paperwork and persistence, where the nurses wore leather and the attending physician was named due process. It should have been funny. It wasn't. It was precise. The landlord, Mr. Duell, lingered under the awning across the street, bathrobe over pajamas, phone in hand like a talisman. He called someone and pointed with his whole spine at the bikes. The rain made a halo of his breath. Alara, Raina said softly. Do you want to be the point tenant on the complaint? Alara's mouth tried to say, no, please choose someone whose shoulders weren't already doing math. Her chest said, yes. Or rather, I'm tired of waiting for someone else to call the code inspector and pronounce the names of our problems like they are allowed to live. Yes, she said. Tell me what it requires. Honesty, Raina said. And the nerve to open your door when the inspector knocks. I have that, Alara said, and was surprised by the certainty in her own mouth. Good, Raina said. Let's open the alley gate. Code likes alleys, there were buildings confess. By 6:10, the first city vehicle rolled to the curb. Not a cruiser, white paint, municipal seal, orange light bar. The inspector climbed out like a man who had expected to find a mess and instead found a choir rehearsal. He listened, he wrote, he groaned at a photo of a stair tread that should have been replaced in the last administration. He walked the alley with Raina and Alara and counted violations on his fingers and then on his clipboard because he ran out of fingers. He took the illegal notice delicately, as if it were an animal that might bite. He read it twice. He raised his eyebrows an inch and made a sound that lived between laughter and disgust. By the book, Mr. Duell, he said when the landlord sloshed into the alley in his slippers. You know the book? The one you're supposed to read? He didn't raise his voice. He just moved it forward. You'll receive a list of corrections and a timeline. You'll meet it. And you'll leave these folks alone while you do. Duell opened his mouth and then closed it when he realized the inspector's pen was writing before he finished his sentence. The rain insisted quietly on the backs of their necks. Somewhere in the building a toddler laughed like a wind chime. Morgan's phone buzzed. He looked down and something in his face changed, a softening and a settling Alara recognized as the expression people wear when the clock they've been pretending not to hear gets loud enough to drown reason. He caught her eye across the alley and touched the helmet to his chest briefly, apology and request in one gesture. She's close, he said when she stepped to him, keeping his voice in their small circle. I gotta go now if I'm gonna make it. Alara nodded. Go. Then, because she was a nurse and because language had long ago surrendered its sense of propriety to the demands of care, do you have someone to sit with you after? Morgan's throat moved as he swallowed. I'll have a lot of someone's before, he said, half smile not making it to full. After is different. I get off at 7 tomorrow morning, Alara said before she could interrogate the impulse. Text me if you want coffee on a curb. He blew out a breath that fogged the rain. Copy. He looked past her to where Timo stood like a flag, soaking wet and happy, into where Luz leaned on the railing, her stubborn hands wrapped in the scarf like she'd made a decision about their pain. He looked back at Alara. Don't sign anything without Reyna. And tell your brother to tie his shoes. He can't be tamed, Alara said. We don't tame, Morgan said. We ride alongside. He squeezed her shoulder once, brief, careful, a mechanic's touch checking a mount point, and then he was gone down the alley, his boots unhurried not because he had time but because haste disrespects moments, and this was one. The minutes after he left took on a new granularity, like sugar turning back into crystals in a cooling syrup. The inspector measured. Photos flashed. The neighbors' complaints became coherent paragraphs instead of repetitive laments. Reyna's pen moved like a metronome. At 7:03, with the rain easing into the kind that makes poets insufferable, the inspector handed Duel a preliminary notice. You'll get the rest by email, he said. And if you think about changing locks, shutting off the boiler, or losing keys, don't. I need a new roof on my house. Your fines would pay for it, but I'd rather not have to do the paperwork. Duel tried a smile whose teeth didn't match. We're all neighbors here, he said to Alara, ignoring Reyna as if she were a television that could be turned down. We can talk this out. Alara had spent years making herself smaller in conversations like this so the other person wouldn't have to confront the size of their own arrogance. She had whispered apologies to landlords and doctors and supervisors because the pen they held could move money and medicine in directions she needed. She felt that habit rise now like an old tide, and then felt it meet a seawall she hadn't known had been built. We are not talking this out, she said, kindly and without heat. You'll fix what the inspector told you to fix. You'll rescind that nonsense notice in writing. And you'll speak to Reyna when you have something to say. She gestured to Reyna with one hand. She is my voice when yours makes me tired. Luz made a small sound behind her that might have been a laugh and might have been prayer. Duel's eyes flicked to the street, to the bikes. He recalculated. When the calculus delivered a result that looked like patience, he nodded and retreated to his door as if the rain had decided to be personal. The first wave of engines idled again, and then moved on, dispersing to other blocks where need was not theatrical but simply present. In their wake they left a building that smelled faintly of orange peels, clean hallways, working smoke detectors, a stack of forms that would become a case, a very irritated landlord, and a countertop that looked like prosperity had stopped by to remember what it felt like to stay. Inside, Alara made breakfast like a nurse writes orders, efficiently, with a hand that knows 3 steps ahead what the 4th will require. Timo ate with focus, as if he'd been given permission to be a boy again. Luz buttered toast with a concentration that made it an art. Alara's phone buzzed once with a text that said, "Made it," and once 2 hours later with a text that said, "Holding her hand." The day that followed could have been ordinary if you squinted. Alara napped in her chair, the kind of nap where the body remembers there is such a thing as off. She woke to the click of the building's front door and the measured steps of someone inspecting their own habits. She made a list of dinner possibilities on the back of the past due notice because reclamation is petty and holy. She helped Luz soak her hands in warm water and Epsom salt until they protested less. She checked Timo's homework not because he needed her to but because the act knits time into something that doesn't fall apart. At 4, she walked 2 blocks to the corner clinic to pick up her mother's refill, raincoat hood up against a drizzle that seemed determined to write itself into the chapter. On the way back, a neighbor from 2B, Kim with the baby who liked to kick precisely when the news said kicking was expected, stopped her. "Those your people?" Kim asked, jerking her chin toward the memory of the bike still hanging in the air like incense. "They're people," Alara said. "Who showed up when we needed showing up?" Kim nodded like that was an answer worth keeping. "They left diapers. And a heater. And fixed the light on our landing that's been dead since Obama." She shifted the baby carrier on her hip. "I ain't scared of men in leather no more. I'm scared of men in suits with clipboards." Elara laughed. The sound didn't bounce off the brick the way it often did, it stuck to the block like a sticker announcing a concert. There are good ones of both, she said. But I hear you. She returned home to find Raina at her table with Luz, drinking tea that tasted like research and lemon. Papers lay in tidy stacks, labeled. Raina had printed copies of the relevant statutes and highlighted the parts that mattered as if she were preparing for court and a PTA meeting simultaneously. We'll file the harassment complaint in the morning, Raina said, tapping one stack. The inspector's full order will follow by email. He already told me off the record that the boiler fails flue standards and the stair is a hazard. That's leverage. Meanwhile, this, she tapped another stack, is the rescission we'd like Dual to sign for the bad notice. I'll send it to him regardless. If he refuses, we escalate. Elara, Luz said gently, Mija, breathe. Elara realized she'd been holding her lungs like full grocery bags. She set them down. Thank you, she said to Raina. For all of it. Raina smiled with half her mouth. I ride sometimes, she said, surprising Elara. Not like the boys. But I learned something from them that helps in hallways like yours. What's that? Timo asked, sprawled sideways on a chair like furniture owed him grace. Torque, Raina said. It's not about force. It's about where you apply it. You can move a lot with the right leverage. She rose, pulled her hood up. I'll be back in the morning. Try not to worry, worry doesn't pay rent. She paused, looked at Elara as if measuring her for a garment. And call me if you hear anything that feels like escalation. We don't let landlords rehearse bad behavior. After Raina left, the apartment felt bigger and calmer, like someone had come through and rearranged the furniture in Elara's mind. She made dinner that used 3 of the new ingredients in satisfying ways. She sent a photo of the plate to Morgan and immediately felt foolish and then foolish for feeling foolish. Fueling up, she wrote. Good, he answered 8 minutes later. She waited for more and got. She's sleeping easy now. Does she want music? Elara typed. She used to. Now she wants quiet. But I play it soft on my phone anyway. Her favorite song lives in my pocket and I ain't about to evict it. After dinner, the building conducted its nightly symphony of ordinary noises, the water heater clicking like a polite cricket, the upstairs closet door sliding with a polite hiss, a television murmuring about a world that existed on the other side of advertisements. Timo fell asleep on the couch with his math book open like a mouth and a pencil balanced behind his ear and his shoes, miraculously, tied. Elara stood at the window and watched the rain wear itself out. The street light flickered once and then recommitted to its purpose. Across the way, Dual's window glowed a peevish yellow. She imagined him pacing, considering, calling his lawyer who told him exactly what Raina had told her, a notice like that could be beaten with a butter knife. He'd try something else. Or he'd retreat. Either way, when he made his next move, she would not be playing catch-up alone. Her phone buzzed. If you're awake, she wants to see the nurse who fixed the tire. Elara didn't tell him she was off shift. She didn't tell him she was not that kind of nurse in this situation. She put on her raincoat, kissed her mother's head, and slipped into shoes without socks because haste, sometimes, is also respect. The address Morgan sent led her 5 blocks east to a hospice that looked like a house that had learned to be a harbor. The night staff recognized the scrubs under the raincoat and let her in with the small smile of people who understand that what happens in rooms like these is not best measured in visiting hours. Morgan met her in the hall, hair damp, eyes both bloodshot and remarkably clear. She's been asking for you, he said, as if that could be true. Then, after a beat, she doesn't know you. But she knows the story. It's the same thing sometimes. The room smelled like lavender and the end of a long road. The woman in the bed had soft skin and a face that had not given up its armor. Her hair was a white halo that refused to lay flat like a truth that refused to be disciplined. Her hands lay atop the blanket, the long fingers of a pianist or a mechanics teacher. This is Elara, Morgan said softly. The nurse. The woman turned her head with effort, found Alara with pupils that still burned their own kind of light. "You got him where he needed to be," she whispered. "You did." Alara took her hand because the body answers questions the mouth cannot. "He would have made it somehow," she said. "But I hate leaving the somehow to luck." The woman's smile went sideways the way smiles do when the muscles have their own opinions. "You and me both." She shifted her eyes to Morgan. "Stop standing like the door's going to arrest you." He exhaled and moved closer, the big man who had learned to be smaller at the edges of beds like this. He took the other hand. The three of them made a little bridge, and for a while all the water moved beneath it without being scary. The woman's name was May. Not a nickname, not a month, a statement of permission that had somehow grown bones. She used the time she had left like a good cook uses odds and ends, nothing wasted, everything seasoned with attention. She told Morgan to replace the leaky gasket on his kitchen sink. She told Alara the secret to making arroz con pollo that doesn't taste like regret. She told a story about a ride that had taken them halfway across the state with a broken clutch cable and 10 friends who refused to let each other be stranded by anything so small as a part. Between stories, she rested. The room adjusted around her rests the way rooms learn to, voices lowering, movements slowing, the air consenting to hold more than it should have to. Alara watched the monitors only in her peripheral vision because sometimes the numbers tell the truth and sometimes the truth would rather be told by the rise and fall of a chest. "Around 2, May said, "Tell me about your mother's hands." Alara did. She kept it short because May's breaths were shorter. She didn't leave out the part where she sometimes resented the jar lids and the buttons and the knotted laces. She didn't leave out the shame that followed resentment like a dog that refuses to recognize the word no. May nodded. "All love is inconvenient," she said. "That's how you know it's love and not a picture of it." Morgan touched his forehead to the back of May's hand in a gesture so private Alara looked away. When she looked back, May's eyes were closed and her mouth was making the shape of sleep. Alara stayed until the nurse on duty slipped in with the quiet of a person who has practiced being invisible and said without saying it that the tide had gone slack and would not come back in the way it once had. May's monitor drew a line that was not so much straight as committed. Morgan made a sound without making a sound, the kind of grief that does not require volume to be infinite. They sat together in the little family room afterward, a space with soft chairs and a bowl of peppermints and an ancient watercolor of a sailboat that had seen more goodbyes than the ocean. Morgan rubbed his hands together like a man washing a part he couldn't get clean. Alara poured water and handed it to him because water is never the wrong answer. "She was the one who told me not to pay every debt with violence," he said finally, voice low. "Said I'd spend my life broke if I did. Said I should try paying in groceries and gaskets and showing up on Tuesdays." He huffed a breath that might have been a laugh in a brighter world. "I told her groceries don't scare people into doing right." She said, "Maybe stop trying to scare them into it and start trying to shame them out of not doing it." Alara thought of the folding table, the clipboards, the oranges. She thought of Raina's pen. She thought of Duel's face when the inspector reminded him that the book existed whether he read it or not. "She was right," Alara said. "She always was," Morgan said, and for a moment the sentence carried more love than loss. They walked out under a sky that had slept a little and found that Dawn was thinking about visiting again. The city smelled washed and sulky, the way cities do when they've been forced to be clean for a while. Morgan looked older and younger at once, as if grief had shined him like a worn coin. "You need anything?" Alara asked. He shook his head, then stopped shaking it, then nodded once in a gesture that contained all 3 answers at once. "I need to keep moving," he said. "If I stop tonight, I'll rust." "Then move," Alara said. "We'll still be there when you need to park." He looked at her like the sentence had a place to live inside him he hadn't cleared out yet. "Copy," he said softly, and went. The next morning, the building woke into a ritual of hammers. Duel had hired a contractor who looked like he'd learned the trade from a YouTube video and a father-in-law who loaned him tools. Raina arrived before 9 with coffee and a copy of the rescission letter on actual letterhead, which is stationery's way of wearing a suit. Duel signed it after arguing with the dot over the I and hereby like punctuation were an insult. The inspector's full order arrived in Raina's inbox at 9:22 with deadlines and photos in a tone that suggested enjoyment had been had by the bureaucrat who wrote it. Alara spent the morning in a new kind of shift, checking in on neighbors not with meds but with information. She taught Kim how to file a maintenance request in writing and where to send a copy so it did not vanish into landlord ether. She read the fine print on a lease for a man in 4C with reading glasses that enlarged the text but did nothing to enlarge his patience. She taped the tenant hotline under the elevator button, because when people are waiting they read things. Between errands, she looked for messages from Morgan that didn't come and then didn't need to come because grief does not owe anyone an itinerary. At noon, the first bike of the day rolled up and parked legal, perfectly between the lines like an apology to the city. Then another. The riders carried lumber in a toolbox that had known 30 years of knuckles. They asked permission before they fixed the railing on the third-floor landing, because kindness without consent is just a hobby. Someone threaded new nylon pull cords through hallway light fixtures and tied neat knots that would not slip. Someone else installed a peephole in Kim's door that could be used without tiptoes. "We're not the landlord," one of the riders told Raina when she raised an eyebrow as the third-floor stair turned from hazard into staircase again. "We're neighbors with tools." "Good neighbors," Raina said. "Who understand the difference between helping and enabling." In the afternoon, a man with a clipboard from a news station approached the block and was gently redirected by 3 separate grandmothers to stories that didn't require raising eyebrows at motorcycles. The evening edition would cover the inspection, the repairs, the complaint, the groceries, and then lose interest because headlines don't love slow, careful victories as much as they love disasters. That was fine. Slow victories do not require applause to be real. At 5:30, Alara's phone buzzed. Finished. She didn't ask how. She didn't need to. "You want that coffee on the curb?" She typed. "Please." They met at the corner where the rain had taught the gutter to sing in 2 different keys. Morgan looked like a man who had done a hard thing and been emptied by it and also, somehow, filled. He held the paper cup like it was the first one thing he'd let himself touch all day. "She went easy," he said. "Like she decided, like she always did. They say people go the way they lived. She lived like a choice and she went like one." Alara nodded. "My grandmother did too." It wasn't a flashback, not in the strict sense. It was a sentence that carried a photograph in its pocket. They sat on the stoop and watched the block do what blocks do. Children argued about the rules of a game that seemed to change every 11 seconds. An old man watered a plant that did not require water but required attention. A woman in a red coat counted her steps because her doctor had asked and she had decided to teach the doctor the difference between asking and meaning it. The city looked back and decided they could stay. "You ever think about leaving?" Morgan asked. "Eloping with possibility?" Alara said. "Sure. Then I remember possibility doesn't do dishes." He laughed. It rolled out of him like something that had been stuck in a pipe and had finally met hot water. "May used to say that. Romance your zip code instead of hating it," she told me. "Find its good coffee and its 3 favorite trees and the one stretch of sidewalk that doesn't try to murder your ankles." "I know those," Alara said. "All 3 trees. And 2 of the coffees. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. Their silence braided with the streets until it felt like something you could lean on." Later, when the light thinned and the evening cooled with intent, Alara returned upstairs to find Luz rolling dough on the counter with hands that had warmed to their task. "We feed them," Luz announced, not bothering to explain who them was because it had been decided the moment oranges arrived at their door. "You don't have to," Alara said. "I never have to," Luz said. "I get to." They made empanadas, beef and onion and raisin the way Alara's abuela had insisted because sweet belongs with salt whether or not you think you deserve both. Timo folded 2 badly and 5 perfectly and watched the August news even though it was October because sports does not know for months. The apartment filled with a smell that could have signed a lease. They carried a tray down to the stoop and set it on an upturned milk crate like a temporary altar. Riders on their way past slowed without stopping and held up fingers in thanks. Neighbors slowed without stopping and took one, then two, then came back with a dish of their own because reciprocity is the city's secret economy. At 9, Raina returned with a folder that had a fatness Alara recognized. Work had been done. Harassment complaint filed, she said, placing it on the counter like a gift. Inspector's deadline served. Boiler company scheduled for Tuesday. Stairfix signed off. She looked around as if counting. "Where's your boy?" "Downstairs," Alara said, tilting her chin toward the stoop. "Learning to accept empanadas as currency." Raina grinned. "Good education." She gathered the forms she would take and the copies she would leave. "I'll be scarce for a couple days unless Duel does something creative. You ever need me, call. You don't need me, call someone else for something fun instead." Balance is a strategy. After Raina left, the night settled like a blanket that had been warmed under a sleeping cat. Alara lay in bed and listened to the building breathe, a sound she realized she hadn't trusted in months. She thought of May and Morgan and the way grief looks like weather until you realize you are also weather. She thought of Duel and the way power behaves when it is reminded it is rented, not owned. She drifted. She dreamed that the stairwell turned into a spine and the bikes were vertebrae and the whole block learned to stand up straight without hurting. In the morning, Dawn did not need an escort. It came on its own feet, steady, sure. The block yawned and stretched and made coffee. A truck backed up to the curb and a refrigerator appeared on the sidewalk, green paint, slightly dented, doors that opened with a sigh. Someone taped a sign to it that said community in block letters that looked like they had been copied from a child's alphabet book. Another sign appeared, take what you need, leave what you can. Oranges shouldered up against yogurt cups. Milk napped against juice boxes. A jar of jam leaned on a loaf of bread like a friend who knows the punchline. Alara stood with her hands in her sleeves and watched the first person open the fridge and take a carton of eggs like a miracle had been stored at 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Morgan arrived without fanfare, which is how the good ones arrive. He parked legal again, helmet dangling exactly the way it had when he'd first stood in her hallway. His eyes looked tired in a way that had decided to be okay with tired. He handed her a small brown paper bag that had the weight of a paperback. "What's this?" she asked. "May's list," he said. She made one of those too. Recipes. Phone numbers. People to call when you need a specialist and his receptionist thinks Mars is closer than his calendar. Places to get legal help without pawning your ribs. The name of her locksmith because she trusted him, which is a sentence you don't get to say every day. Alara took it like a pastor takes the relic, careful, reverent, aware of the temptation to make superstition out of wisdom. She peeked inside. The first page said, "For when the month gets heavy." The second said, "For when you forget you're brave." "I don't know how to say thank you for something like this," she said. "Use it," Morgan said. "And add to it." They didn't hug. They didn't need to. Their shoulders sorted out the math of space on their own. Duel emerged from his doorway mid-morning not with a bathrobe but with a clipboard, trying on competence again like a shirt that fit better today because it had been tailored by fear. He pointed at the community fridge. He opened his mouth. He closed it when half the building turned their faces toward him with expressions that said, "We have read the book and we have a lawyer's number on the fridge and also we have empanadas, and you cannot compete with that." He nodded instead. "Don't block the sidewalk," he said, and the inspector, materializing on cue, said from behind him, "They aren't." Alara learned something in that moment she should have known but hadn't. Abusers do not fear decency, they fear documentation. She made a note on May's list and felt the odd joy that accompanies growing teeth and deciding not to use them. At noon, the block turned into a fair without the noise. A woman from Wanna set up a table with a little sign that said free haircuts and gave Timo the best lineup he'd ever had in his life, which is a dangerous thing to say to a 17-year-old. A retired carpenter fixed a loose hinge on 3DS door because doors should not be haunted by drafts. Another rider changed the oil on a scooter that had believed itself doomed. Someone tuned a guitar because the block had decided to sing later whether or not anyone could carry a tune. Elara took a break because Raina had taught her balance was a strategy and because Luz had threatened to pinch her if she didn't sit down for 10 minutes. She sat on the stoop and let the sun touch the part of her wrist that had worn gloves all night and paperwork all day. She closed her eyes. She opened them when a shadow fell across her face that made her feel larger instead of smaller. Morgan stood there, helmet in the crook of his arm, a look on his face like a man about to say a thing he had turned over in his mouth until the rough edges were gone. "I got a question," he said. "Okay," Elara said. "You ever need a gig that isn't in a hospital?" Elara blinked. "A gig? We got a garage," he said. "Couple of us keep it open legit. We don't do anything cute. Oil changes, brake jobs, tire plugs." He smiled. "You're overqualified." He sobered a hair. "We could use somebody who knows how to talk to people who are scared and broke and proud. Also, Raina says she'll pay you to help her clinic on Tuesdays if you want. I'm not trying to steal you from nursing. I know people need you there. I'm saying, if a day off looks like a paycheck too, maybe you take it." Elara tried to assemble the facts into a sentence that felt permitted. She failed, in the best way. "I'll think about it," she said. Thank you." "No," Morgan said. "Thank you." He tipped the helmet toward her. "For the plug. For the breakfast. For the don't leave the somehow to lock. I got it taped on my mirror." The afternoon stretched and softened and finally agreed to let evening take its turn. Lights came on behind curtains. The community fridge hummed contentedly, full and then not full and then full again because reciprocity doesn't obey conservation laws. The building had learned a new word and could pronounce it, together. At sunset, Elara walked to the roof. She hadn't been up there in months, not since the time a leak had made the ceiling threaten to sag and she'd pretended roofs didn't exist to keep from crying. The air on the roof was a different species of clean. The city looked less like a puzzle to be solved and more like a body that could be cared for if enough hands learned the choreography. Morgan found her there because his internal map had already added her to its landmarks. He stood at the edge, not at the parapet but near enough to see how the street below had decided to be a river of ordinary grace for the rest of the week. "She loved roofs," he said. "May said it's where you remember the world is bigger than your landlord." Elara smiled. "Smart woman." They stood without conversation for a while. Then Elara said, "I used to be embarrassed about needing help. It felt like I was failing at adulthood. Like if I just worked more, I wouldn't need it." Morgan considered the horizon. "I used to be embarrassed about giving it," he said. "Felt like it looked like charity. Like I was saying I had and you didn't." May said help is a wheel. If you get a turn pushing, be glad. Your turn riding will come soon enough. The first star smuggled itself into the sky. Elara didn't make a wish. She made a plan. Tomorrow she would call the specialist May's list had blessed. She would take the Tuesday clinic shift if the hospital schedule allowed. She would ask Timo what he wanted beyond pretending not to care. She would buy a better plug kit and put it in the trunk like a talisman that had learned to live in the real world. A fresh engine note rose from the street below. Not a wave this time. Not an army. One bike, then two, then three, enough to imply a pattern. Elara looked down. The riders moved deliberately, the way people do when they're delivering a promise instead of a threat. "What's this?" she asked. "Thursday," Morgan said. "We decided Thursdays are grocery days till the fridge can keep itself full on momentum alone." "You decided," Elara said, not a question. Morgan said. May put it on her list. Don't let Thursdays lose their nerve. They descended together and found the street making room for boxes again. The neighbors were better at it this time. Someone had set out a traffic cone from a construction job that never restarted. Someone else had chalked a hopscotch in a place where it would not trip old feet. Children supervised, because children always do when the stakes are joy. Elara took her place not as hostess or supplicant but as node, one of many points in a web that could stretch without breaking. She lifted boxes, signed forms, answered 3 separate questions about egg storage with the patience of a woman who knew the difference between salmonella and superstition. Luz held court on the stoop and told a story about a girl who had once eaten pickles for a week and lived, in her hands, traitors that they were, behaved in public as if they had never known pain. Duel came out and looked once and then looked again with new eyes, not because he had become a different man overnight but because the math around him had changed. He could no longer pretend each tenant was a solitary problem to be moved, they had become a set. His breath fogged. He went back inside and, if the inspector's later notes were to be believed, called 3 contractors instead of 1. Near midnight, the block quieted in that reluctant way that says joy would stay if the body didn't insist on sleep. Elara locked the fridge's child latch and taped a note that said, "Resting, back at 6. She turned toward the building and found Morgan watching her like a man grateful to have learned the art of departure. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he asked. "For groceries that don't demand anything. For the law with teeth. For asking about coffee." She paused. "For letting me open the door first." He nodded once. "You had to be the one. It's your hallway." He put his helmet on. He lifted the visor. His eyes found hers with that level steadiness she had come to recognize as the opposite of intensity's cheap cousin. "I'll be around," he said. "Not always loud. But if you need heavy things carried, if somebody needs a landlord read to them like scripture, if a tire goes soft. Don't leave the somehow to luck," she finished. He grinned. "Exactly." He swung a leg over the bike. The engine caught and settled into a heartbeat her nervous system had apparently decided to accept as safe. He eased into the street, waited for a taxi to pass because courtesy is also a form of rebellion, and disappeared into the hour when the city tries to remember its own origin story. The building slept. The fridge hummed. The rain, having made its point, left the stage to a breeze that smelled like laundry and basil and warm oil on metal. Elara stood in the doorway of the home she could now call defended and felt a steadiness she had not permitted herself in years. Inside, on the counter, May's list lay open to a page in a hand as neat as a measured life. "When you think you are alone, check your door. Someone might be on the other side with oranges." Elara smiled so quietly the room didn't notice. She turned off the light. She slept. A week later, the inspector's second visit earned the building a list with more lines crossed off than added. Duel, newly literate in the book he had previously only pretended to own, scheduled the boiler replacement without being told twice. Raina filed a follow-up noting compliance with a note about the community fridge that made a local bureaucrat's day. The Grocery Thursdays persisted into a thing. Photographs appear on walls and feeds without tagging faces, because privacy is also a kindness. And one morning, because stories like this insist on circling back to where they began, a bike coughed to a halt on the service road by the hospital's back fence. A younger man this time, helmet too shiny, learning the math of torque the hard way. Elara, coming off a shift that had beaten her but not gotten the trophy, turned her feet toward the sound. She found the nail by feel. She pushed in the plug and watched the rubber hold like a secret. "You carry a kit?" the kid asked, impressed to the point of reverence. "I carry everything," she said. "Welcome to nursing." He tried to pay. She pointed at the horizon. "Pay it forward," she said. "The inconvenient kind." He nodded, bewildered and obedient, and rode into a morning that behaved better for having been told what it was for. Elara watched him go and looked down at her hands. They were not her mother's hands yet. They were not untouched either. They were tools that had learned both the soft work and the hard. She flexed them and felt how the month no longer lived in her shoulders alone. It lived in a folder on the counter in a fridge on the street and on a road where a man named Morgan rode a bike that did not leave anybody stranded who didn't want to be. When she reached her block, the community fridge door swung open on its new hinge with a little squeak she decided never to oil because it had become the sound of enough. She took an orange. She peeled it. She handed half to her mother and half to her brother and kept a slice for herself, soft-hearted and bright and bluntly honest, the way mornings are when they belong to you. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.